I watched my aunt rip the envelope in half without even opening it. She tossed both pieces onto the kitchen table like it was junk mail, crossed her arms and said, "I don't need handouts from a dead woman." My uncle laughed. My cousin laughed. My mother stood there nodding like she agreed, even though she'd spent the last 3 days driving 4 hours from Kelowna to get here. I picked up my envelope. I didn't open it either. Not then, not in front of them. I just folded it carefully and slipped it into the inside pocket of my jacket. Nobody noticed. My name is Lily, and I'm 31 years old. 6 months ago, I thought I understood what my family was. Now I know I never really knew them at all. My grandmother, Gran, we called her, died in late October just as the first snow was starting to come down on her property outside of Peterborough. She was 83 years old, sharp as a tack until her very last week, and she had more opinions about how people spent their money than anyone I've ever met. She didn't believe in showing off. She drove a 2009 Civic until the transmission gave out. She bought her winter coat at Value Village and she was proud of it. She made her own bread on Sundays and she kept a notebook, a physical paper notebook, where she tracked every dollar that came in and every dollar that went out, the way her own mother had taught her during a time when there weren't any other options. She also, as it turned out, had $2.3 million sitting in a registered account with RBC, and nobody in the family knew about it except her estate lawyer. I found this out the same way everyone else did, at the reading of her will, in a room that smelled like old carpet and photocopier toner, in a law office off George Street in Peterborough on a cold Tuesday morning in November. There were 7 of us in the room. Her 3 adult children, my mother, my aunt and my uncle, plus my uncle's wife, my cousin and me. And the estate lawyer, a soft-spoken woman named Miss Chen, who had clearly done this many times before, and had long since stopped being rattled by how families behaved in these moments. Chen read through the preamble sections first. The house, Gran's properties outside of town, the one with the wood stove and the leaning barn, was to be sold, and the proceeds split equally among her 3 children. That part nobody argued with. Then she got to the registered accounts. She explained, carefully and precisely, that Gran maintained a separate TFSA and RRSP over several decades, and that the combined balance at the time of her passing was just over $2.3 million. My aunt made a sound like she'd been poked. Miss Chen continued. Gran had directed that this amount be distributed as follows: 1/3 each to her 3 children, contingent on them having maintained what the will described as a consistent and caring relationship with her in the 10 years prior to her passing, as verified by her estate trustee. And then, and this is the part that changed everything, a separate bequest of $180,000 to me, her granddaughter, specifically designated for education or professional development, to be distributed directly and unconditionally. My uncle leaned forward. What does contingent mean in this context? Chen explained it again, the same way she'd just explained it, but slower. My aunt stood up. She didn't storm out, didn't raise her voice. She just stood up and said very calmly, "That's not what she promised us. I don't know what my grandmother promised them. I only know what my grandmother told me, which was, 'Lily, the ones who show up are the ones who deserve to stay.' She said that to me 3 years ago, when I drove up alone to spend a weekend with her in October because everyone else was busy. We made soup, we watched Jeopardy. She showed me her notebook, running her finger down the columns, explaining how she'd started with almost nothing when she first came to Ontario and had simply never stopped paying attention. I didn't know then that she was trying to tell me something. I thought she was just talking." My mother didn't say anything in Miss Chen's office. She sat very still with her hands folded in her lap, and I couldn't read her face at all. On the drive back to my aunt's house where we were all staying, the conversation happened mostly without me. I sat in the back seat while my aunt drove and my uncle rode passenger, and they talked about the word contingent, like it was a personal insult. My aunt said Gran had always favored my mother. My uncle said Gran had never forgiven him for moving to Calgary. My aunt said the estate lawyer seemed biased. My uncle said there should be a second opinion. Nobody asked what I thought. That night, while my aunt and uncles sat at the kitchen table with a bottle of Niagara Red and went over every family slight of the last 2 decades, I went upstairs and finally opened my envelope. It was a letter, handwritten, in Gran's careful, upright printing, on the kind of notepaper she kept in a drawer beside her telephone. "Lily," it said, "you came when it mattered. You didn't make me feel like a burden. That is not as common as it should be." The money in this envelope is yours without conditions, because you never made me feel like I owed you anything for showing up. Use it well, I know you will. All my love, Gran. There was a certified check folded inside the letter, $180,000 made out to me. I sat on the edge of the guest bed for a long time. I could hear my aunt and uncle downstairs, their voices rising and falling. At some point, my mother's voice joined them. In the morning, I came down to find all three of them sitting at the table with coffee, waiting for me. My aunt spoke first. "We've been thinking," she said, "about fairness." I got myself a glass of water. I stood at the counter. She said they felt the distribution wasn't balanced. She said Gran must have been confused in her final years about what she'd promised. She said the $180,000 I'd received was meant to be part of the family pool, and that if I was any kind of decent person, I'd understand that. My uncle nodded. My mother looked at the table. "I'd like to see the check," my aunt said. "No," I said. "Lily." Her voice had that particular tone I remembered from childhood, the one that meant she was deciding for all of us. "Be reasonable." "I am being reasonable," I said. "Gran left me that money. It's in her will. I'm not discussing it." My aunt said Gran wasn't in her right mind in those last years. My uncle said the estate could be contested. My aunt said she already had a lawyer, a friend of a friend in Barry, who'd said there were grounds. My uncle said the word undue influence like he'd just learned it. My mother said quietly, still looking at the table, "Maybe you could just think about it." I looked at my mother for a moment. She didn't look back. I picked up my jacket and my bag, and I drove to the nearest Tim Hortons and sat there for an hour with a large coffee, and then I did the thing I probably should have done the night before. I called the bank. I'd already taken a photo of the check before I'd gone to sleep. I called RBC's estate services line and explained the situation, that I'd received a check from a deceased family member's estate, that I wanted to deposit it, and that I wanted to understand exactly what steps I needed to take, and what would happen if the estate were contested. The woman I spoke to was extremely patient. She walked me through the process. She told me that the bequest to me was separate from the contingent distributions, that it was unconditional as written in the will, and that once I deposited the certified check, the funds would clear through normal estate verification, but would not be subject to a hold based on other beneficiaries disputing their own shares. She also told me that if anyone tried to freeze or reverse the deposit, I would be notified directly and would have full legal standing to respond. I thanked her and hung up. Then I drove to the RBC branch in downtown Peterborough and deposited the check. The branch manager, a man named Mr. Okafor, according to the nameplate on his desk, handled the transaction himself once I explained the context. He was calm and professional. He told me the funds would be available within a standard processing window, and that I should keep copies of all estate documentation. He gave me his direct line. He also said gently, "You'd be surprised how often families don't realize that destroying or refusing a check doesn't destroy the underlying transfer authorization. The money doesn't disappear just because the paper does." I didn't tell him that nobody in my family had destroyed anything yet, but I filed that away. 2 days after I got back to Toronto, my aunt called to tell me she was moving forward with contesting the will. She said it with real confidence, like it was already decided. I let her finish talking, then I said, "Okay, you should know that I've already deposited the check and spoken with the bank about the estate process. If you're filing a challenge, my lawyer will hear from yours." She paused. "You have a lawyer?" "I do now," I said. I hadn't had one 2 hours earlier, but I'd spent that morning on the phone with a legal referral service through the Law Society of Ontario, and I had an appointment that afternoon with an estate's lawyer in the annex. Her name was Ms. Whitfield, and she was exactly what I needed: direct, unsentimental, and deeply unbothered by my aunt's Barry contact, who'd apparently suggested there were grounds. Whitfield explained to me that contesting a will in Ontario requires evidence of either lack of testamentary capacity, undue influence, or improper execution. She reviewed the copy of Gran's will I'd brought. She looked at the letter Gran had written me. She was quiet for a moment. "Your grandmother was a very organized woman," she said. "She kept a notebook," I said. "Every dollar, for 60 years. Ms. Whitfield nodded slowly. "The language in this will is precise. The bequest to you is clearly separated from the contingent distributions. The condition attached to the other beneficiaries is explicit and documented. If your family tries to contest this, they'll need to do more than assert that they expected something different." She also told me something I hadn't known. Gran had been assessed by her family physician within the last year of her life, and the assessment was on file. She had been found to be of full testamentary capacity. Ms. Chen, the estate lawyer, had noted this in her files. Your grandmother planned for exactly this, Ms. Whitfield said. I sat there and thought about the notebook. I thought about October and soup and Jeopardy. I thought about her finger running down those columns. I thought about how she'd said, the ones who show up are the ones who deserve to stay. She knew. She knew exactly what was going to happen, and she had covered every corner. My aunt's legal contact apparently reviewed the actual documents and advised her that the case was not strong. I found this out 3 weeks later, not from my aunt but from my cousin, who called me from a Tim Hortons parking lot in Barrie and said she was sorry. I didn't really know what to say to that, so I said thank you. She's really angry, my cousin said. I know, I said. Do you think she'll get anything from the estate? I thought about that. The contingent distributions, the 1/3 shares for the 3 children, were subject to verification by the estate trustee, based on the quality and consistency of the relationships. My uncle had been largely absent from Gran's life since moving to Calgary 8 years ago. My aunt had seen Gran 4 times in the last decade, mostly at Christmas, and had spent 2 of those visits complaining about the drive. My mother, to her credit, had visited more often, but she had also been the one sitting at the table last November saying, maybe you could just think about it. What the trustee would find, I didn't know. That wasn't my decision. What I knew was my $180,000. I'd already enrolled in a continuing education program in urban planning at U of T, something I'd been putting off for years because the cost felt impossible. I'd paid the first semester fees. I had a meeting with a financial advisor scheduled for the following week to talk about putting the rest in a TFSA and thinking through the next few years. Gran would have approved of that. I could almost see her writing it down in the notebook. My aunt sent me one more message about 6 weeks after the deposit cleared. It was long, 3 paragraphs about family loyalty and what Gran would have wanted and how I'd always been selfish even as a child. She said I had taken advantage of an old woman's loneliness. She said she hoped I could live with myself. I read it twice. Then I put my phone down and went for a walk along the waterfront, which is what I do when I need to think without anyone's voice in my ear. I thought about the letter in Gran's handwriting. You didn't make me feel like a burden. I thought about the soup we made that October. She'd taught me how she did the broth, starting with the bones, cold water, bringing it up slowly, skimming the surface, nothing rushed. She said the patience was the point. She said most people wanted to skip ahead to the finished thing, and they never understood that you can't. I thought about my mother, who I hadn't spoken to since November. She'd sent me a text in December, just Merry Christmas, hope you're well, and I'd replied the same way. Neither of us had called. I thought about my cousin in the Tim Hortons parking lot saying she was sorry. I thought about what Gran had said, and I thought about who had actually shown up. When I got home, I deleted my aunt's message without responding. Not because I was angry, I wasn't by then, but because there wasn't anything left to say. The will had said it, the bank had confirmed it, the lawyer had confirmed it. Gran had written it down in her own handwriting and signed her name at the bottom. The ones who show up are the ones who deserve to stay. I printed that line out and taped it to the wall beside my desk, where I do my coursework in the evenings after I get home from my job at the community health center. It's the first thing I see when I sit down. Some mornings I think about calling my mother. I haven't yet. Maybe I will. That particular door hasn't been locked, just left very quietly ajar with no certainty about what's on the other side. But the envelope I folded into my jacket that November morning in the room that smelled like old carpet and photocopier toner? That one's settled. Gran knew what she was doing. She always did. She just waited, patiently, the way she'd learned to make broth, bringing everything up slowly, skimming the surface, nothing rushed. She was right about the patience being the point.